Some losses cut so deep they change a man forever. When everything you've worked for lies dead in the dirt, you face a choice that defines who you really are. Reed Mallory stood in his ranch yard, staring at the carnage. 23 cattle, 4 horses, and his prize bull, all killed in a single night by one massive mountain lion. The tracks told the story clearly enough. This wasn't hunting for food. This was something else entirely. With his wife buried 2 winters past and his savings gone, this ranch was all Reed had left. The beast had taken everything. Now, it was his turn to take something back. He loaded his Winchester, saddled his remaining horse, and followed the tracks into Redwater Canyon. What Reed expected was a quick hunt and justice served. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and the wild country that had shaped his life. But why would a killer mountain lion lead him straight into the most dangerous trap of his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Reed Mallory had come to Utah Territory with Sarah in the spring of '79, young and foolish enough to believe love could conquer the harshness of frontier life. They'd married in Virginia, where his family had lived for 3 generations, but the pull of untamed land and fresh starts had whispered to them both. Sarah had been the daughter of a Methodist minister, with eyes the color of creek water in sunlight and a laugh that could warm a man through the coldest winter. She'd followed him west with nothing but faith and a small inheritance from her grandmother. The ranch they'd built together sat in a valley between 2 ridges, protected from the worst winds, but open enough to catch the morning sun. Sarah had insisted on planting wildflowers along the fence line, saying that even working land deserved beauty. Those flowers still bloomed every spring, though Reed hadn't tended them since she passed. The house they'd built, log by log, stood solid against the weather, but it felt hollow now, echoing with memories of laughter and gentle conversation. In his shirt pocket, Reed carried Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to her mother. He'd taken it off her finger the day they buried her, unable to leave it in the cold ground. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too hard, he'd roll it between his fingers and remember the weight of her hand in his. The ring had become his anchor to the man he'd been when she was alive, before grief had worn him down to something harder and more bitter. The ranch had never been easy, but they'd made it work together. Sarah had kept chickens and a garden, sold eggs and vegetables to the folks in Millfield, the nearest settlement 12 miles east. Reed had run cattle, modest numbers but good stock, and bred horses that were known for their steady temperament. They'd planned to expand, to build something lasting for the children they'd hoped would come. But Sarah's body had betrayed them. 2 stillborn babies in 3 years, and then the fever that took her just as suddenly as winter takes the last autumn leaves. Jim Hawthorne, the old-timer who ran the spread to the north, had been checking on Reed with increasing frequency since Sarah's funeral. Jim had fought in the Mexican War and knew something about loss, though he'd never married. He'd stop by with coffee and tobacco, sitting on Reed's porch in comfortable silence or sharing stories from his younger days. Jim had warned him about the mountain lion tracks he'd seen near the creek, but Reed had been too wrapped up in his own struggles to pay proper attention. "That's a big cat," Jim had said just last week, pointing to prints in the mud near the water. "Bigger than anything I've seen in 20 years out here. You keep your rifle close." Martha Coleman ran the general store in Millfield and had known Sarah well. The 2 women had become fast friends, bonding over their shared love of books and their determination to bring a touch of civilization to the rough territory. Martha had tried to help Reed through his grief, bringing him home-cooked meals and gentle conversation, but he'd pulled away from everyone, finding solace only in hard work and solitude. The morning of the attack, Reed had awakened before dawn, as was his custom. The silence struck him first. No lowing of cattle, no nickering from the horses. In the pale light of early morning, he'd walked out to find his world destroyed. The bull, Caesar, had been his pride, a massive Hereford he'd bought with the last of Sarah's inheritance money. The animal lay twisted and torn, its throat opened by claws powerful enough to crack bone. The cattle were scattered across the pasture, some partially eaten, others killed and left untouched, as if the predator had been driven by rage rather than hunger. The horses had tried to escape, but the lion had cornered them against the fence. Reed's mare, Duchess, had been Sarah's favorite, a gentle sorrel with a white blaze. Finding her body broke something in Reed that had been barely holding together since the funeral. This wasn't just about money or livestock, this felt personal, as if the wild country was taking the last pieces of the life he'd tried to build. Standing in the ruins of everything he'd worked for, Reed felt the weight of his Winchester in his hands. The rifle had belonged to his father, a Union cavalry officer who'd carried it through Gettysburg and Antietam. It was a weapon that had seen death and dealt it when necessary. Reed had learned to shoot with this rifle, had used it to put food on their table and protect their stock from coyotes and wolves. But nothing had prepared him for destruction on this scale. The tracks told a clear story. One animal, moving with purpose and incredible size. The stride was longer than any mountain lion Reed had ever tracked, the paw prints deep and distinct in the soft earth near the creek. But what disturbed him most was the pattern. This hadn't been random killing. The lion had moved methodically through his stock, selecting targets with what seemed like deliberate malice. Jim Hawthorne arrived just as Reed was loading supplies into his saddlebags. The old man took one look at the carnage and whistled low through his teeth. "Damn, Reed, I'm sorry. I should have pressed you harder about setting watch." "Wouldn't have mattered," Reed replied, checking his ammunition. "Look at these tracks. This thing's bigger than both our horses combined. A watch wouldn't have stopped it. Where are you headed?" "Following the trail. It goes up toward Redwater Canyon." Jim's weathered face creased with worry. "That's rough country, son. Lots of places for a big cat to turn the tables on a man. Maybe we should get some of the boys together, make it a proper hunting party." Reed shook his head, settling his hat firmly on his head. "This is personal now. That beast killed everything Sarah and I built together. I'm finishing it." The tracks led northwest, toward the maze of canyons and mesas that marked the boundary between settled land and true wilderness. Reed had hunted in that country before, but always with company and never venturing too deep. Stories circulated about men who'd gone into those canyons and never come out, though whether they'd fallen victim to the landscape, the weather, or something worse, was never clear. As Reed rode away from the ranch, he carried more than just his rifle and supplies. In his heart burned a flame of purpose he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. For the first time in 2 years, he had direction, something to fight for. The beast had made a mistake in taking everything from him. Now he had nothing left to lose and every reason to see this through to the end. The morning sun climbed higher as Redwater Canyon opened before him, its red walls rising like ancient battlements against the sky. Somewhere in that wilderness waited the creature that had destroyed his life. Reed Mallory rode forward, not knowing that he was about to discover that some hunts change the hunter more than they ever touch the hunted. The entrance to Redwater Canyon opened like a wound in the earth, carved by centuries of flash floods and wind into a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden chambers. Reed had been tracking for 3 hours when the mountain lion's trail led him into this maze of sandstone and shadow. His horse, a steady gelding named Buck, moved carefully along the rocky path, ears alert for any sound that might signal danger. The tracks were easier to follow here in the sandy washes between the stone walls. Each print told Reed more about his quarry, the spread of the toes, the depth of the impressions, the occasional scrape marks where claws had extended for better purchase on the rock. This was no ordinary mountain lion. The prints were nearly the size of his own hand, and the stride suggested an animal that moved with both power and intelligence. But as Reed progressed deeper into the canyon, he began to notice something that troubled him. Scattered along the trail were the remains of other kills, deer, elk, even a young bear, but these carcasses showed none of the savage destruction he'd found at his ranch. These animals had been killed cleanly, efficiently, and most had been partially consumed. It was normal predator behavior, the kind of hunting pattern Reed had observed countless times in his years on the frontier. The contrast was stark and unsettling. Why had the lion killed his livestock with such brutal excess while hunting normally in its own territory? Reed dismounted near a deer carcass that couldn't have been more than 2 days old. The kill showed the precise bite to the neck that marked an experienced predator, and the way the meat had been consumed spoke of hunger satisfied, not rage unleashed. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting the canyon walls in deep red and purple shadows, Reed found himself questioning what had driven the attack on his ranch. He'd assumed it was simply a rogue predator, driven to desperate measures by hunger or territory disputes. But the evidence suggested something different, something that spoke of purpose rather than madness. The trail led him through a series of narrow passages where the canyon walls closed in so tightly that Reed had to dismount and lead Buck by the reins. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the stone and the occasional call of a hawk circling high overhead. In this cathedral of ancient rock, Reed found his anger beginning to cool into something more thoughtful. He'd been so consumed by grief and rage that he hadn't stopped to consider the deeper questions. Mountain lions were territorial animals, but they typically avoided human settlements unless driven by extreme circumstances. For such a large predator to venture so far from its natural hunting grounds suggested either desperation or something else, something that had forced it to take risks no wild animal would normally accept. By late afternoon, Reed had penetrated several miles into the canyon system. The walls rose hundreds of feet above him now, creating a world apart from the open rangeland he called home. Here, ancient petroglyphs marked the stone, left by peoples who had hunted these canyons long before white settlers arrived. Reed paused to study the weathered images, hunters with spears, animals in profile, mysterious symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. The lion's tracks continued steadily northwest, following what appeared to be a well-worn game trail. But Reed began to notice other signs that shouldn't have been there, the remains of a campfire, carefully concealed, but not old enough to have been made by wandering Indians or trappers passing through. Someone else had been in this remote place recently, someone who had taken pains to hide their presence. As evening approached, Reed made camp in a sheltered alcove where a seep of water had created a small pool surrounded by greenery. The spot offered good visibility of the approaches and enough grass for Buck to graze. Reed built a small fire, more for companionship than warmth, and settled in to consider what he'd learned. The mountain lion's behavior made no sense unless viewed through a different lens. What if the attack on his ranch hadn't been random predation, but something more deliberate? What if the animal had been driven to desperation not by hunger, but by threat? Reed had seen enough of frontier life to know that when wild animals behaved strangely, there was usually human interference at the root of it. The fire crackled softly as Reed cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. 43 rounds of .44-40 cartridges, enough for a normal hunt, but perhaps not enough if he encountered more than just one large predator. The weight of his father's cavalry saber at his hip provided some comfort, though he hoped the situation wouldn't come to close-quarters combat. As full darkness settled over the canyon, Reed found himself thinking about Sarah and the conversations they'd had about the changing nature of the frontier. She'd been more perceptive than he'd given her credit for, often noting how the arrival of new settlers and the expansion of territorial government had displaced not just the native tribes, but the wildlife as well. "Everything's connected, Reed," she'd said one evening as they watched deer drinking from their creek. "When you change one thing, everything else has to adjust. Sometimes that adjustment comes at a cost that's higher than anyone expected." The night sounds of the canyon were different from those on his ranch, more mysterious, touched with echoes that seemed to carry whispers from the ancient past. Coyotes called from the rim rocks above, their voices blending into a wild symphony that spoke of freedom and danger in equal measure. Reed dozed fitfully, his hand never far from his rifle, alert for any sound that might signal the approach of his quarry. Just before dawn, Buck snorted and stamped, his ears pricked forward toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon. Reed came fully awake in an instant, rifle ready, but whatever had disturbed the horse passed by without revealing itself. In the pale morning light, Reed found fresh tracks in the sand near his camp, not the mountain lion, but something else that made his blood run cold. Boot prints, human tracks. Someone wearing military-style footwear had passed within 50 yards of his camp during the night, moving with the kind of stealth that spoke of training and purpose. The tracks followed the same general direction as the lion's trail, disappearing into the maze of stone passages that led toward the heart of the canyon system. Reed broke camp quickly, his mind racing with new possibilities. The mountain lion wasn't the only dangerous predator in these canyons. Whatever had brought men with military training into this remote wilderness, it wasn't likely to be anything good. Reed checked his weapons one more time, made sure his water bottles were full, and urged Buck forward along the increasingly treacherous trail. The hunt for the mountain lion had become something much more complicated, and Reed Mallory was beginning to understand that he might have followed more than just animal tracks into the depths of Redwater Canyon. He might have stumbled into something that would test not only his skills as a frontiersman, but his capacity to distinguish between justice and revenge, and to choose the harder path when the time came. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson as Reed pressed deeper into the stone maze. The boot prints he'd discovered troubled him more than he wanted to admit. In his years on the frontier, he'd learned to read sign like other men read newspapers, and these tracks spoke of men who moved with purpose and discipline, military men, or at least men trained by the military. The trail wound through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall by centuries of erosion. Here, the mountain lion's tracks became mixed with those of the mysterious humans, creating a pattern that suggested both predator and men were following the same route, deeper into the wilderness. Reed dismounted frequently to study the overlapping sign, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. The lion had passed this way first, probably within the last day. The boot prints were fresher made sometime during the night, which meant whoever had walked past his camp was still ahead of him. The thought sent a chill down Reed's spine despite the warming air. He was no longer just tracking a dangerous animal, he was following armed men into country where help was days away, and the law was whatever a man could enforce with his own weapons. As the trail descended into a wider section of the canyon, Reed found evidence that stopped him cold. Caught on a stand of thorny brush, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze, was a piece of fabric. But this wasn't the rough homespun or denim that most frontier travelers wore. This was army blue, the distinctive color of Union cavalry uniforms, though faded and worn. Reed dismounted and carefully worked the cloth free from the thorns. The material was wool, well made, and recently torn. On closer examination, he could make out part of what might have been a sergeant's stripe, though the fabric was too damaged to be certain. Whatever soldiers had passed through this remote canyon, they weren't on any official patrol Reed had heard about. The discovery changed everything. Mountain lions were dangerous, but predictable. Men with military training operating in secret far from any legitimate authority was something else entirely. Reed had served briefly in the Colorado Territorial Militia during the Indian Troubles of the early 80s, and he'd learned enough about military thinking to recognize when something didn't add up. Buck whickered softly and shook his head, as if sensing his rider's growing unease. Reed patted the horse's neck and spoke in the calm, steady voice that had always soothed the animals in his care. "Easy, boy. We'll figure this out as we go." The canyon opened into a wider valley, where a seasonal creek had carved a meandering path through stands of cottonwood and willow. Here, the tracking became more complex. The mountain lion had paused to drink, leaving clear prints in the mud at the water's edge, but the human tracks spread out in a pattern that suggested the men had made camp here, probably for several hours. Reed found the remains of their fire, carefully concealed but still detectable to someone who knew what to look for. The ashes had been scattered, and the fire ring disguised with natural stones and debris, but the faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the still air. More troubling were the other signs, areas where the grass had been flattened by bedrolls, places where horses had been picketed, and the unmistakable impression of military-style organization in how the camp had been laid out. These weren't drifters or outlaws. These were men accustomed to following orders and operating as a unit. Reed counted at least 4 separate sleeping areas, suggesting a small squad of soldiers or former soldiers. But what were they doing so far from any military installation, and why were they taking such pains to conceal their presence? The memory of Sarah's voice came to him as he knelt beside the hidden fire ring. She'd always been curious about the stories that drifted in from other settlements, tales of missing army supplies, weapons shipments that never reached their destinations, and the growing problems with Indian raids that some people whispered were being supplied by white men trading illegally in firearms. "There's more going on out here than folks want to admit," she'd said one evening when news had reached them of another ranch burned out near the territorial capital. "Too many coincidences, too many things that don't quite make sense when you add them all up." Reed had dismissed her concerns at the time, focused as he was on the immediate challenges of running their ranch. But now, following sign through this remote canyon, he began to wonder if Sarah's intuition had been more accurate than his practical skepticism. The trail led out of the valley and into another series of narrow passages, but here Reed noticed something that made him proceed with even greater caution. The mountain lion's tracks had changed subtly. Where before the animal had been moving steadily but calmly, now there were signs of agitation, deeper impressions, where the big cat had pushed off more forcefully, occasional scrape marks on the stone, where claws had extended for better purchase. The lion was being pursued, or at least pressured by something behind it. The timing suggested that the animal and the mysterious soldiers were aware of each other, possibly even in some kind of deadly game of hunter and hunted. Reed found himself caught in the middle of a situation he didn't fully understand, but one that was clearly more dangerous than a simple predator hunt. As the day wore on and the sun climbed toward its zenith, Reed pushed deeper into the canyon system. The walls closed in again, creating a tunnel of stone that muffled sound and made Buck increasingly nervous. The horse's ears never stopped moving, constantly alert for threats that might be lurking just beyond the next turn in the trail. Reed's own senses were stretched to their limits. Every shadow might conceal an enemy. Every sound might herald an attack. The weight of his Winchester felt reassuring in his hands, but he was acutely aware that he was outnumbered and far from any help. If the soldiers ahead of him were involved in something illegal, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a witness who had stumbled into their operation. The thought of Sarah's ring in his shirt pocket strengthened his resolve. He'd made a promise to himself to see this through, to bring justice to the creature that had destroyed everything they'd built together. But justice was becoming a more complicated concept with each piece of evidence he uncovered. By afternoon, Reed reached a point where the canyon split into 3 separate passages. The mountain lion's trail went to the right, following what appeared to be a well-used game path. The boot prints of the soldiers led straight ahead, toward a passage that climbed steeply between narrow walls. The third option, to the left, showed no recent sign but offered the most direct route deeper into the canyon system. Reed studied the options carefully, aware that his choice might determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The smart thing would be to follow the soldiers, to find out what they were doing, and avoid any confrontation with the mountain lion until he better understood the situation. But his original mission had been to track the beast that killed his stock, and every instinct told him that the animal was the key to understanding everything else that was happening in this remote wilderness. After a long moment of consideration, Reed urged Buck onto the right-hand trail, following the mountain lion deeper into the maze of stone and shadow. Whatever answers waited in the heart of Redwater Canyon, he sensed that the big cat would lead him to them more surely than trying to second-guess the movements of armed men who clearly knew this country better than he did. The trail wound upward through a landscape that seemed carved from another world, and Reed Mallory rode deeper into mysteries that would test everything he thought he knew about justice, survival, and the true nature of the wild country that had shaped his life. The afternoon heat shimmered off the canyon walls as Reed followed the mountain lion's trail through increasingly treacherous terrain. The path had become little more than a series of ledges carved by wind and water, barely wide enough for Buck to navigate safely. Each turn revealed new vistas of red stone and empty sky, but also brought fresh evidence that the situation was far more complex than Reed had initially understood. Near a small seep, where water had carved a depression in the sandstone, Reed found something that made his pulse quicken. Scattered around the tiny pool were spent cartridge casings, but not the brass cases that marked civilian ammunition. These were the copper-colored remnants of military rounds, the kind issued to army units and rarely seen in civilian hands. Reed dismounted and gathered several of the casings, examining them carefully in the harsh afternoon light. The head stamps bore the unmistakable mark of government manufacture, and the caliber was .45-70, the standard for military rifles. But what disturbed him most was their condition. These rounds had been fired recently, probably within the last few days, and they were scattered in a pattern that suggested hasty shooting rather than careful target practice. Buck snorted and pawed at the ground, his ears laid back in a way that spoke of deep unease. Reed looked up from the brass casings to see what had spooked his horse and felt his own blood run cold. There, pressed deep into the mud at the edge of the water, was a paw print that dwarfed every track he'd seen before. The mountain lion had paused here to drink, and the depth of the impression spoke of an animal that weighed at least 200 pounds, a giant among its kind. But it wasn't just the size of the track that troubled Reed. Around the clear print of the lion's paw were the marks of other creatures, smaller cats, probably juveniles, and what looked like the scattered impressions of some kind of struggle. The mud had been churned by multiple animals, and darker stains in the earth suggested that blood had been spilled here. Reed studied the scene with the careful attention to detail that had kept him alive through years of frontier living. The story the ground told was disturbing. The big female for Reed was now certain it was a mother cat had brought her young to this water source. They had been surprised by the soldiers, who had opened fire with their military rifles. Some of the cubs had been killed or wounded, and the mother had been forced to flee with whatever offspring she could save. The pattern of brass casings and the churned earth painted a picture of unnecessary violence. Mountain lions were dangerous predators, but they typically avoided humans unless cornered or defending their young. These soldiers had apparently stumbled upon a family group and responded with overwhelming firepower, killing cubs that posed no real threat to armed men. Reed felt a familiar anger building in his chest, but this time it wasn't directed at the mountain lion. The big cat's attack on his ranch was beginning to make sense in a way that changed everything he thought he knew about his quest for vengeance. If soldiers had killed her cubs at this waterhole, the mother's desperate hunt for food to sustain any remaining offspring might have driven her to attack the easiest targets available, Reed's isolated livestock. The trail led away from the water in a different direction, no longer following the game paths, but striking directly across country toward a series of mesas that rose like ancient fortresses against the sky. The mother lion was moving with purpose now, her tracks showing the determined stride of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. Reed followed, his perspective on the hunt fundamentally altered by what he'd discovered. As the afternoon wore on, Reed found more evidence of the soldiers' passage. They had made another camp in a hidden arroyo, this one larger and more elaborate than the first. The remains of their fire were more carefully concealed, but Reed's trained eye picked out the signs of extended occupation. These men had been in the canyon system for days, possibly weeks, and they were clearly familiar with the terrain. More troubling were the other items Reed found scattered around the hidden camp. Pieces of rope that had been cut rather than untied, suggesting haste or emergency. A leather pouch that had contained ammunition, now empty and discarded. Most disturbing of all, a piece of paper that had been weighted down with stones, apparently used as some kind of makeshift table, and still bore the faint impressions of writing. Reed carefully lifted the paper and held it to catch the slanted light of the late afternoon sun. The impressions were barely visible, but his eyes, trained by years of reading sign in difficult conditions, could make out fragments of what appeared to be a list. He could see partial words, rifles, ammunition, shipment, and what looked like numbers that might have been quantities or prices. The implications hit Reed like a physical blow. He wasn't just dealing with rogue soldiers, he'd stumbled into what appeared to be a weapons smuggling operation. The remote canyon would be perfect for such activities, far from the established trails and settlements where territorial authorities might notice unusual activity. But smuggling weapons to whom, and for what purpose? Reed's military service had been brief, but he remembered the constant concerns about arms falling into the wrong hands. Indian tribes that had been forced onto reservations were sometimes tempted by traders offering modern weapons in exchange for traditional goods or stolen livestock. More dangerous still were the reports of Mexican revolutionaries seeking American arms to fuel their ongoing conflicts south of the border. The Mountain Lions Trail led away from the soldiers' camp, heading toward a series of narrow canyons that cut deep into the mesa country. Here, the landscape became even more forbidding, vertical walls of stone rising hundreds of feet, creating corridors so narrow that the sky was reduced to a thin strip of blue far overhead. Reed had to dismount and lead Buck through passages where the walls almost touched, places where an ambush would be impossible to escape. But the big cat seemed to know this country intimately. Her tracks never hesitated at intersections, never showed the kind of backtracking that marked an animal unsure of its route. She was heading toward something specific, something that drew her through this maze of stone with the determination of a creature that had no choice but to press forward. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Reed made camp in a small chamber carved from the rock by centuries of flash floods. The space was defensible, with only one narrow entrance and a small pool of water fed by seepage from above. Buck was grateful for the water and the chance to rest, but the horse remained nervous, constantly testing the air for scents that might signal danger. Reed built a small fire, more for light than warmth, and settled in to examine the evidence he'd gathered. The brass casings, the torn piece of army cloth, the paper with its suspicious impressions, each piece added to a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than the simple predator hunt he'd originally envisioned. Sarah's ring rolled between his fingers as Reed considered his options. He could turn back now, return to his ranch, and report what he'd found to the territorial authorities. But the nearest law enforcement was days away, and by the time officials could organize an expedition into the canyon, the smugglers would likely have completed whatever business had brought them here. More important, the mountain lion was still out there, still driven by whatever desperate need had led her to attack his livestock. Reed was beginning to understand that she might not be the villain of this story, but rather another victim of the same forces that had brought armed men into this remote wilderness. The true enemy might not be the predator he'd come to hunt, but the humans who had disrupted the natural balance through their illegal activities. The fire crackled softly in the narrow chamber as Reed made his decision. Tomorrow he would continue following the lion's trail, not as an agent of vengeance, but as someone seeking to understand the full truth of what had happened in these canyons. Whatever he found at the end of the trail, he was determined to see justice done, but justice for all the victims, not just revenge for his own losses. Reed Mallory settled back against the stone wall, his rifle close at hand, and prepared to spend another night in the heart of a mystery that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about right and wrong in the wild country of Utah Territory. Dawn came slowly to the narrow confines of Reed's stone shelter, filtering down from far above in shafts of pale gold light. He had slept fitfully, disturbed by dreams of Sarah, and awakened twice by sounds that might have been footsteps echoing through the canyon passages. Buck had been restless too, standing alert through most of the night, with his ears constantly moving to track sounds that Reed's less acute hearing couldn't detect. The morning brought a discovery that confirmed Reed's growing suspicions about the true nature of his situation. While searching for a way to replenish his water supply, Reed climbed to a higher ledge and found himself looking down into a hidden alcove where someone had made a more permanent camp. The site was well concealed from ground level, but from his elevated position, Reed could see clear evidence of extended occupation. Most telling of all was what appeared to be a supply cache, wooden crates stacked under a natural overhang, protected from weather but readily accessible to anyone who knew where to look. Reed made his way carefully down to the cache, leaving Buck secured at the water source, and discovered confirmation of his worst fears about the soldiers in the canyon. The crates bore the unmistakable stenciling of U.S. Army Quartermaster supplies, but they had been pried open and their contents removed. Packing materials scattered around the site told the story these boxes had contained rifles, ammunition, and other military equipment. But most damning of all was a piece of water-stained paper that had been used to line one of the crates, apparently a shipping manifest that detailed the contents of an arms shipment bound for Fort Douglas. Reed studied the manifest with growing alarm. The weapons listed included not just the standard infantry rifles he'd expected, but also newer repeating rifles, cases of ammunition, and even some of the new cartridge belts that were revolutionizing military logistics. This wasn't the work of opportunistic thieves. This was organized theft on a scale that suggested corruption within the military supply system itself. The implications were staggering. If active duty soldiers were diverting weapons shipments for illegal sale, the consequences could destabilize the entire territory. Indian tribes, Mexican revolutionaries, or even domestic criminal organizations could acquire firepower that would make them formidable opponents to territorial law enforcement. Reed realized he had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple predator hunt. He was looking at evidence of treason. The mountain lion's trail led away from the weapons cache, following a route that suggested the big cat had also discovered this site, but had been disturbed by human activity and moved on. Reed found more brass casings scattered around the area, and the pattern of tracks in the sandy soil told a story of hasty departure. The soldiers had been here recently, probably within the last day, and they had left in response to some kind of threat or deadline. Following the lion's trail away from the cache, Reed began to piece together a timeline that explained the attack on his ranch. The mother cat had been using this area as part of her territory, probably denning somewhere nearby with her cubs. The arrival of the smugglers had disrupted her normal hunting patterns, and the killing of her young had driven her to desperate measures to feed any surviving offspring. Reed's anger, which had burned so hot against the mountain lion, now found a new target. These men had caused a cascade of tragedy that reached far beyond their immediate criminal activities. Their presence had displaced a natural predator, leading to the destruction of Reed's livestock and the death of animals that had been Sarah's pride and joy. The soldiers weren't just thieves, they were the root cause of everything that had gone wrong. The trail descended through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall, leading toward what appeared to be a broader valley hidden deep within the mesa country. Here, Reed found evidence of the mountain lion's increasing desperation. The tracks showed that she had attempted to hunt several times, but each effort had been interrupted or unsuccessful. Deer sign was plentiful in the area, but the presence of armed humans had made the prey animals skittish and difficult to approach. Reed paused at a natural lookout point where the trail curved around a prominent rock formation. From this vantage point, he could see several miles of the valley floor spread out below him. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Rising from a grove of cottonwoods near the center of the valley was a thin column of smoke, the kind produced by a well-managed fire, not a natural blaze. The smugglers were still in the canyon, and they had established what appeared to be a base camp in the most defensible position available. Reed studied the distant smoke through the small field glass he carried for spotting livestock, and could make out the regular geometric shapes that marked human construction canvas shelters, supply dumps, and what looked like a rope corral for horses. More disturbing still were the figures moving around the camp. Even at this distance, Reed could count at least 6 men, and their movements had the organized efficiency of military personnel. These weren't desperate deserters or opportunistic thieves. They were operating as a disciplined unit, which suggested that their illegal activities had official sanction from someone high enough in the chain of command to provide cover for their operations. The mountain lion's trail continued toward the valley floor, but Reed noticed that the tracks had changed character again. Where before the big cat had been moving with the steady purpose of an animal heading toward a specific destination, now the prints showed more caution. The stride was shorter, the impressions deeper where the cat had paused to test the air or listen for threats. Reed made his own careful descent toward the valley, leaving Buck secured at the lookout point where the horse would be safe from discovery but available for a quick escape if necessary. Moving on foot, Reed could travel more quietly and take advantage of cover that wouldn't accommodate a mounted man. His years of hunting experience served him well as he worked his way down the canyon wall, using natural features to mask his approach. The closer he got to the valley floor, the more evidence Reed found of the disruption the smugglers had caused to the natural order. Game trails that should have been busy with animal traffic showed no recent sign. Water sources that should have attracted deer and elk were deserted. The entire ecosystem had been thrown out of balance by the presence of armed humans who cared nothing for the delicate relationships that governed life in this remote wilderness. Reed found himself thinking about Sarah's words regarding the interconnected nature of frontier life. She had understood, perhaps better than he had, that changes in one part of the system inevitably affected everything else. The smugglers hadn't just stolen military property, they had created a wave of consequences that reached into every aspect of life in the canyon, from the displacement of wildlife to the destruction of Reed's ranch. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor, Reed reached a position where he could observe the smugglers' camp without being detected. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the scope of their operation. The camp was laid out with military precision, complete with designated areas for different functions and clear fields of fire covering all approaches. These men were professionals, and they were prepared for trouble. But most importantly, Reed could see additional evidence of their criminal activities. Stacks of wooden crates, similar to those he'd found at the cache site, were arranged under canvas shelters. Men moved between the boxes with the efficient purpose of soldiers loading a supply train. Whatever transaction they were preparing for, it was significant enough to justify weeks of preparation in this remote location. Reed settled into a concealed position where he could maintain surveillance while considering his options. He was one man with a rifle against at least 6 trained soldiers in a defensible position. Direct confrontation would be suicide, but returning to report what he'd found would take days and might allow the smugglers to complete their business and disappear. The mountain lion's trail continued past the smugglers' camp, heading toward the far end of the valley where the canyon walls closed in again. Reed realized that the big cat was probably aware of the human presence, but was driven by necessity to continue toward whatever destination had drawn her into this particular part of her territory. Her cubs, if any, had survived the soldiers' attack, were somewhere ahead, and maternal instinct was compelling her to risk everything to reach them. For the first time since beginning his hunt, Reed felt a kinship with his quarry. Like the mountain lion, he was driven by loss and the need to protect what remained of the life he'd built. Like her, he found himself forced to make dangerous choices in pursuit of justice for those he'd loved. The difference was that Reed now understood who the real enemy was, and it wasn't the four-legged predator he'd been tracking. As evening approached and the smugglers' camp settled into the routine of posted guards and carefully banked fires, Reed made his decision. Tomorrow, he would continue following the mountain lion's trail, but not as a hunter seeking vengeance. Instead, he would track the big cat as a fellow victim of the soldiers' criminal activities, hoping to find answers that would allow him to bring real justice to the canyon, justice for Sarah's memory, for his destroyed ranch, and for the natural order that had been so callously disrupted by human greed. Reed spent the night in a shallow cave carved from the canyon wall, positioned where he could watch the smugglers' camp while remaining hidden from their sentries. The disciplined rotation of guards told him these men were taking no chances with security, posting fresh lookouts every few hours and maintaining a watchfire that would illuminate any approach from the valley floor. Their professionalism was both impressive and deeply troubling. This wasn't the work of deserters or opportunistic thieves, but of soldiers still following military protocols, even while engaged in criminal activities. The mountain lion's trail had led past the camp during the night, the tracks visible in the sandy wash that carried seasonal runoff from the canyon walls. Reed studied the prints by the pale light of dawn and found them different, yet again deeper, impressions that spoke of an animal carrying additional weight, moving more slowly but with unwavering determination toward whatever destination awaited in the narrow canyon beyond the valley. The realization hit Reed like a physical blow. The mountain lion was carrying something, most likely an injured cub that had survived the soldiers' attack but was too weak to travel on its own. The mother's desperate hunt for food, her attack on his livestock, the dangerous journey through territory occupied by armed men, it all made sense now. She wasn't a rogue predator driven by bloodlust, but a mother trying to keep her offspring alive in the face of overwhelming odds. Reed felt ashamed of the rage that had driven him into the canyon. Sarah would have understood the mountain lion's motives immediately, would have seen past the surface destruction to the deeper tragedy beneath. Her gentle wisdom had always helped him see beyond his own immediate concerns to the larger patterns that connected all life on the frontier. Now, too late, he was beginning to understand what she would have told him from the beginning. The smugglers broke camp just after sunrise, moving with the efficient precision of a military unit preparing to march. Reed watched from his concealed position as they loaded pack animals and organized their gear with careful attention to weight distribution and security. But instead of moving toward the canyon mouth and the outside world, they headed deeper into the maze of stone passages, following a route that paralleled the mountain lion's trail. Reed waited until the last of the soldiers had disappeared around a bend in the canyon before emerging from his hiding place to examine their abandoned campsite. What he found there confirmed his suspicions about the scope of their operation and added new dimensions to the threat they represented. Scattered papers, probably discarded as too dangerous to carry, revealed fragments of correspondence with buyers whose names Reed didn't recognize, but whose locations ranged from Mexico to the Indian territories. Most disturbing of all was a partial letter written in Spanish, apparently from someone representing a revolutionary faction operating in the border regions. The letter spoke of payment in gold and silver, delivery schedules, and the urgent need for materials to continue the struggle against oppression. Reed's Spanish was limited, learned from Mexican vaqueros who had worked on neighboring ranches. but he could read enough to understand that the weapons being stolen from army shipments were destined for groups that posed a direct threat to American territorial authority. The implications were staggering. If these stolen weapons reached their intended recipients, they could fuel conflicts that would destabilize the entire region. Indian tribes with modern repeating rifles would be formidable opponents to army patrols. Mexican revolutionaries armed with American weapons could launch raids across the border that would provoke international incidents. The corruption that had spawned this smuggling operation could ultimately lead to a level of violence that would dwarf anything the territory had experienced since the end of the Indian Wars. Reed gathered the most incriminating documents and tucked them into his shirt pocket alongside Sarah's ring. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he was determined that evidence of this conspiracy would reach the proper authorities. But first, he had to survive long enough to carry that evidence out of the canyon, and that meant understanding what the smugglers were planning in the remote wilderness ahead. The trail led through a narrow defile where the canyon walls rose so high that the sky was reduced to a thin ribbon of blue far overhead. Here, the mountain lion's tracks showed increasing signs of stress. The prints were irregular, suggesting that the animal was struggling with fatigue and the burden of whatever she was carrying. Dark stains on the rocks indicated that blood was being lost, either from the mother's own wounds or from an injured cub that was beyond her power to heal. Reed found himself hoping that the big cat would reach her destination before her strength failed entirely. Whatever den or safe haven she was seeking in this remote country, it represented the last hope for her family's survival. The thought that his quest for vengeance might have prevented a mother from reaching her injured offspring filled Reed with a guilt that was almost unbearable. The canyon opened into another hidden valley, this one smaller and more secluded than the first. Ancient ruins, scattered across the valley floor, testified to earlier human occupation, probably ancestral Pueblo peoples who had used this remote location as a refuge or ceremonial center. The mountain lion's trail led directly toward the largest of the ruined structures, a natural cave that had been enlarged and modified by the ancient inhabitants. But Reed's attention was drawn to more recent signs of human activity. The smugglers had been here before, probably using this valley as a staging area for their operations. Supply caches were hidden among the ruins, and there were clear signs that horses had been pastured here for extended periods. More ominously, Reed found evidence of recent digging, carefully concealed excavations that suggested the soldiers had been burying something they didn't want discovered. A closer examination of the digging sites revealed fragments that made Reed's blood run cold, pieces of bone, weathered by exposure, but not old enough to be from the ancient inhabitants. Scraps of cloth that looked like they might have come from civilian clothing. The smugglers weren't just stealing weapons, they were eliminating witnesses, and this remote valley had become their private cemetery. Reed realized he was looking at evidence of multiple murders. Traders who had stumbled upon the operation, perhaps, or army personnel who had discovered the theft and tried to report it. The corruption went deeper than he had imagined, involving not just theft, but the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the conspiracy. The mountain lion's trail led directly to the largest cave, and Reed followed it with growing apprehension. If the big cat had chosen this place as her den, she might be trapped there with her injured offspring, unable to continue her journey. The smugglers were somewhere behind him, moving with purpose toward the same destination. Reed might be walking into a confrontation that would pit him against both human enemies and a desperate predator protecting her young. As he approached the cave entrance, Reed could see clear signs that the mountain lion had indeed taken refuge here. Fresh scrape marks on the stone, tufts of fur caught on projecting rocks, and the distinctive musky scent that marked a big cat's den. But there were also other signs, human footprints that were older than the lion's tracks, suggesting that the smugglers had used this cave before and might consider it their exclusive territory. Reed paused at the entrance, his Winchester ready, but his heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever he found inside might force him to make choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mountain lion was no longer his enemy. She was a fellow victim of the human predators who had turned this remote wilderness into their private hunting ground. But she was still a dangerous animal, protecting her young, and she might not distinguish between the soldiers who had killed her cubs and the rancher who had tracked her with vengeance in his heart. The sound of voices echoing from deeper in the valley told Reed that the smugglers were approaching the ruins. Time was running out for whatever mercy he might be able to show the mountain lion, and for his own chances of escaping this remote valley alive. Whatever secrets the cave held, Reed was about to discover them in circumstances that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, justice, and the true nature of survival in the wild country that had shaped his life. Reed Mallory stepped into the darkness of the cave, following the mountain lion's trail toward a confrontation that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone touched by the spreading corruption that threatened to consume the territory he called home. The cave opened into a vast chamber carved from the living rock by centuries of water and wind. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, faded images of hunters and animals that spoke of human occupation stretching back countless generations. But Reed's attention was immediately drawn to movement in the shadows at the far end of the chamber, a massive shape that resolved into the mountain lion he had been tracking for 3 days. She was even larger than he had imagined, a magnificent predator that would have commanded respect in any circumstances. But what stopped Reed cold was what lay beside her in a shallow depression, lined with grass and soft earth. A single cub, no more than a few months old, its golden fur matted with dried blood from wounds that spoke of violence rather than accident. The cub was alive, but barely. Its breathing was labored, and one rear leg was clearly broken, probably from a rifle bullet that had shattered bone without killing instantly. The mother lion had carried her injured offspring here, to this ancient place of sanctuary, in a desperate attempt to keep it alive. She turned to face Reed as he entered the chamber, her yellow eyes reflecting a mixture of protective fury and exhausted desperation. Reed raised his Winchester, the weapon that had belonged to his father, the tool he had carried into this wilderness to deliver justice for the destruction of his ranch. For a moment, predator and man faced each other across the chamber, each recognizing in the other a creature driven by loss and the need to protect what remained of the life they had built. But Reed couldn't pull the trigger. The mountain lion wasn't the enemy he had come to destroy. She was a mother, protecting her wounded child, driven to desperate measures by the same forces that had brought armed criminals into this remote wilderness. The attack on his ranch had been an act of desperation, not malice. The only way a starving predator could feed an injured offspring when her normal hunting grounds had been disrupted by human intruders. Reed slowly lowered his rifle, and the tension in the chamber eased slightly. The mother lion continued to watch him with wary intelligence, but she no longer crouched in preparation for an attack. Instead, she turned back to her cub, nuzzling the small creature with a gentleness that spoke of powerful maternal bonds. It was then that Reed noticed the other evidence scattered around the chamber. Human bones, bleached white by time, but not ancient, like the cave's original inhabitants. These were the remains of more recent visitors, and the bullet holes in several of the skulls told a story of execution rather than natural death. The smugglers had been using this cave as more than just a supply depot. It was their private killing ground, where witnesses were brought to die far from any chance of discovery. But among the bones, Reed found something that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. Half hidden beneath a skull that still wore the remnants of a cavalry officer's hat was a leather portfolio, its contents protected from the elements by the cave's dry atmosphere. Reed opened the portfolio with trembling hands and found documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy he had stumbled into. The papers included correspondence between high-ranking army officers, territorial politicians, and business interests, with investments in mining and railroad development. The weapons theft wasn't just criminal opportunism, it was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to destabilize the territory by arming various hostile factions, creating the justification for increased military presence and martial law that would benefit certain commercial interests. The murdered officer whose remains lay in the cave had apparently discovered the conspiracy and attempted to report it to authorities in Washington. His death had been ordered by men whose names Reed recognized from newspaper articles about territorial development, respected figures whose public reputations masked their involvement in a scheme that amounted to treason. Reed stared at the documents, realizing that he held evidence of corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. But he also realized that possessing such evidence made him a target for the same fate that had befallen the officer whose bones lay scattered around the cave floor. The smuggling operation he had discovered was just the tip of an iceberg that could sink everyone involved in its exposure. The sound of approaching voices echoed from the cave entrance, and Reed knew that the soldiers were finally closing in on their base of operations. He looked around the chamber, taking in the wounded cub, the protective mother lion, and the evidence of systematic murder that surrounded them. In a moment of clarity that seemed to carry Sarah's voice, Reed understood what he had to do. The real enemies weren't the mountain lions trying to survive in a disrupted ecosystem. The real enemies were the humans who had turned this wilderness into a theater for their criminal activities, who had displaced the natural order and created the cascade of violence that had ultimately reached Reed's ranch. Justice wouldn't come from killing the big cat, it would come from exposing the conspiracy that had made her desperate actions necessary. Reed quickly gathered the most incriminating documents from the portfolio and tucked them into his shirt, alongside the evidence he had collected earlier. Then he looked at the mountain lion and her injured cub, understanding that they were all victims of the same ruthless men who were approaching the cave with weapons drawn and murder in their hearts. "I'm sorry," Reed whispered to the big cat. Though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing for tracking her with vengeance in his heart or for the human actions that had driven her to such desperate measures. The mountain lion watched him with those penetrating yellow eyes, and Reed had the strange sense that she understood more than an animal should about the complexities of the situation they all faced. The voices were getting closer, and Reed could make out individual words now. The soldiers were discussing the cave, debating whether anyone could have discovered their secret. Their leader, a man whose voice carried the authority of rank, was ordering a thorough search of the chamber, elimination of any evidence, and the permanent sealing of the cave to prevent future discovery. Reed realized that the soldiers intended to kill the mountain lions as well, probably to eliminate any trace of the disturbance their activities had caused in the local ecosystem. The wounded cub would be put out of its misery with a bullet, and the mother would be shot down as she tried to defend her offspring. Then the cave would be dynamited, burying the evidence of their crimes beneath tons of rock. The approaching footsteps told Reed that he had perhaps minutes before the soldiers reached the chamber. Looking at the mountain lion and her cub, then at the evidence of systematic murder that surrounded them, Reed made a decision that would have seemed impossible when he first entered Redwater Canyon 3 days earlier. He wasn't going to let the real killers claim any more victims. Reed Mallory checked his ammunition, positioned himself behind a natural rock formation that would provide cover, and prepared to stand with his former enemy against the common threat that had brought so much death and destruction to the wilderness they both called home. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of justice in a territory where corruption had reached levels that threatened the very foundations of law and order. The mountain lion seemed to sense the change in Reed's posture and purpose. She moved protectively over her cub, but no longer watched Reed as a threat. Instead, her attention turned toward the cave entrance, where the voices of armed men grew steadily closer. In the ancient chamber where so many secrets were buried, an unlikely alliance was about to be tested in the crucible of violence and survival. Reed positioned himself behind a natural barrier of fallen stone near the back of the chamber, his Winchester loaded and ready, but his mind was racing through possibilities that went far beyond the immediate confrontation. The documents he carried represented evidence that could bring down a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, but only if he survived long enough to deliver them to honest authorities, and if any such authorities actually existed. The mountain lion had moved her wounded cub deeper into the shadows, but she remained alert and ready to defend her offspring. Reed found himself studying her magnificent form and remembering Sarah's words about the interconnected nature of all life on the frontier. The big cat wasn't his enemy, she never had been. She was simply another creature trying to protect what mattered most in a world where human greed had disrupted the natural order. The approaching voices grew clearer, and Reed could make out at least 4 distinct speakers. Their leader had the clipped accent of an East Coast education, overlaying the rough edges of frontier military service. The man was giving orders with the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding life and death, discussing the elimination of evidence and witnesses as if he were planning a routine patrol. "Sergeant Mills, take Johnson and check the back chambers," the leader commanded. "Corporal Hayes, you're with me. We sweep this place clean and seal it permanently. Nobody outside our unit can ever know this location exists." Reed recognized the tactical thinking behind the order. They were dividing their forces to cover more ground quickly, but they were also spreading themselves thin in an environment that favored defenders who knew the terrain. Reed had fought in enough frontier skirmishes to understand the advantages of interior lines and concentrated firepower against a dispersed enemy. But he was still outnumbered 4-1, facing trained soldiers in a confined space where movement would be limited and ricochets dangerous. His only advantages were surprise, superior position, and the fact that his enemies didn't yet know he was there. Reed would have to make every shot count and use the cave's geography to prevent the soldiers from coordinating their attacks. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the chamber as the first 2 soldiers entered. Reed could see them silhouetted against the lighter background of the cave entrance, a sergeant and a private, both carrying rifles at the ready and moving with the practiced caution of veterans. They paused just inside the chamber, allowing their eyes to adjust to the dimmer light while scanning for threats. "Jesus," the private whispered, catching sight of the scattered bones. "How many people did we bring here?" "Enough," the sergeant replied grimly, "and we'll bring more if that's what it takes to keep this operation secure. The colonel's not paying us to have consciences." Reed felt his jaw clench at the casual way they discussed murder. These weren't soldiers gone bad under the pressure of frontier service. They were hired killers, wearing army uniforms, men who had corrupted their oath to serve and protect into a license for systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The mother lion stirred restlessly in the shadows, her protective instincts warring with her recognition that sudden movement might trigger a gunfight that would endanger her cub. Reed could see her yellow eyes reflecting the faint light from the cave entrance, and he had the strange sense that she was waiting for his signal, ready to coordinate her attack with his if the situation demanded it. The second pair of soldiers entered the chamber, and Reed could see that their leader was indeed an officer, a captain, judging by the insignia visible on his uniform. The man moved with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition to his will, surveying the bone-littered chamber like a landowner inspecting his property. "Sergeant, have your men search every corner," the captain ordered. "I want confirmation that our security hasn't been compromised. If anyone has discovered this location, we need to know about it before we proceed with tomorrow's transaction." Tomorrow's transaction. Reed realized that he had arrived at a critical moment in the smugglers' operation. Whatever major sale or transfer they were planning would happen within hours. which meant that stopping them now could prevent weapons from reaching buyers who would use them to destabilize the entire region. But it also meant that failure would have consequences far beyond Reed's personal quest for justice. If the conspiracy succeeded in arming hostile factions with stolen military weapons, the resulting violence could set back territorial development by decades and cost hundreds of innocent lives. Reed reached into his shirt pocket and felt Sarah's ring beneath the documents he had gathered. Her gentle wisdom seemed to guide his thoughts as he considered the choices before him. She would have understood the mountain lion's desperate actions, just as she would have understood the larger moral imperative that now drove Reed's decisions. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice for his destroyed ranch or the murdered officer whose bones lay scattered around the chamber. This was about preventing a conspiracy that threatened everything decent people were trying to build in the territory: schools and churches, families and communities, the rule of law that separated civilization from chaos. The soldiers were spreading out through the chamber now, their search pattern bringing them steadily closer to Reed's position. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they discovered either him or the mountain lion, and once the shooting started, there would be no time for careful planning or measured responses. Reed thought about his father's cavalry saber hanging at his hip alongside the Winchester. The weapon had seen action at Gettysburg and Antietam, had been carried by a man who fought to preserve the Union against forces that would have torn the country apart. Now it might be called upon to serve a similar purpose, defending territorial integrity against enemies who wore the uniform but had abandoned the principles it was supposed to represent. The private nearest to Reed's position was moving carefully among the scattered bones, apparently looking for evidence of recent visitors. He paused near the portfolio where Reed had found the incriminating documents, and Reed could see recognition dawning in the man's eyes as he realized that someone had been through their secret archives. "Captain," the private called softly, "somebody's been here. Recent tracks, and the document case has been disturbed." The officer's response was immediate and decisive. "Battle formation, gentlemen. We have an intruder, probably armed and definitely dangerous. Take him alive if possible. We need to know what he's learned and who he might have told." Reed watched the soldiers shift into combat positions with the fluid efficiency of men who had drilled together extensively. They weren't just criminals, they were a disciplined military unit that had been corrupted by their leadership but retained their tactical skills and unit cohesion. But they were also men who had grown comfortable with easy victories against unarmed civilians and unsuspecting fellow soldiers. They weren't prepared for a fight against someone who understood their methods and was willing to match their ruthlessness with determination born of righteous anger. The mountain lion had gone completely still in the shadows, her predator's instincts telling her that violence was imminent. Reed could see her muscles coiled for action, ready to strike if the situation deteriorated into open conflict. The wounded cub remained hidden deeper in the shadows, but Reed could hear its labored breathing, a reminder that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the fate of an innocent creature whose only crime was being born into a world where human greed had made survival a matter of life and death. Reed drew his father's saber with his left hand while keeping his rifle ready in his right. The blade caught the faint light from the cave entrance, and Reed remembered the stories his father had told about the weight of command in battle, how officers had to make decisions that would send good men to their deaths in service of causes larger than any individual life. Now Reed faced a similar burden. Whatever he did in the next few moments would echo far beyond this hidden chamber in the Utah wilderness. The evidence he carried could expose a conspiracy that threatened territorial stability, but only if he lived to deliver it. The mountain lion and her cub deserved protection from the men who had destroyed their family, but saving them might mean sacrificing the larger mission. Reed Mallory took a deep breath, tasted the ancient air of the chamber where so many secrets were buried, and prepared to make choices that would define not just his own legacy, but the future of justice in a territory where the line between law and lawlessness had become dangerously blurred. The silence in the chamber stretched taut as a bowstring until the private's boot crunched on a piece of bone, and Reed knew the moment for decision had arrived. He rose from behind the stone barrier with his Winchester aimed at the officer's chest, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his purpose. "United States Marshal," Reed called out, the lie coming smoothly as he remembered stories of federal lawmen operating undercover in territorial disputes. "You men are under arrest for theft of government property and conspiracy against the United States." The soldiers froze, caught between surprise and training. The captain's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Reed's rifle barrel never wavered from its target. In the confined space of the chamber, Reed's superior position gave him a crucial advantage. He could see all four men, while they had to search for him among the shadows and scattered bones. "I don't think so," the captain replied after a moment's consideration. His voice carried a confidence that suggested he had faced down challenges to his authority before. "There's no federal jurisdiction out here, and even if there were, you're outnumbered 4-1. Drop your weapon, and we can discuss terms." "The terms are simple," Reed responded, shifting slightly to keep all four soldiers in view. "You surrender your weapons and submit to arrest, or I start shooting. Your choice, Captain." The officer's laugh was cold and calculating. "You're bluffing, Marshal. If you were really federal law, you'd have backup. You're here alone, which means you're either a fool or a dead man." It was then that the mountain lion chose to reveal herself. The great cat stepped into the light, her massive form moving with the fluid grace of a born predator. She positioned herself between the soldiers and her wounded cub, her yellow eyes fixed on the men who had invaded her sanctuary. The sight of the magnificent predator, easily capable of killing any of them with a single swipe of her claws, transformed the tactical situation in an instant. "Sweet Jesus," one of the privates whispered, his rifle swinging toward the mountain lion. "That thing's huge. Hold your fire," the captain snapped, recognizing that gunshots in the confined chamber would create chaos that could only benefit Reed. "It's just an animal. We can deal with it after we handle our human problem." But Reed could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes. They had grown comfortable with murdering unarmed civilians and eliminating inconvenient witnesses, but facing a natural predator in her own territory was something entirely different. The mountain lion represented a force they couldn't bribe, threaten, or corrupt, a reminder that some things in the wilderness answered only to laws older than human government. "She's not just an animal," Reed said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "She's the mother of the cubs you murdered at the waterhole. You disrupted her territory, killed her offspring, and drove her to attack my ranch. You're responsible for everything that's happened here." The captain's face went pale as he realized the implications of Reed's words. If this rancher had tracked the mountain lion back to their secret base, he had seen evidence of their entire operation. The weapons caches, the murdered witnesses, the documents that detailed their conspiracy, all of it was compromised. "Sergeant Mills," the captain ordered quietly, "work your way around to the right. Johnson, you take the left. We need crossfire to pin down our friend while Hayes and I advance." But the confined space of the chamber made tactical movement difficult, and the presence of the mountain lion added an unpredictable element that no military manual had prepared them for. As the soldiers began to spread out, the big cat moved with them, her predator's instincts, recognizing the threat pattern even if she couldn't understand the human motivations behind it. Reed knew he had to act before the soldiers could establish crossfire positions. His father had taught him that in confined combat, initiative was everything. The first man to move decisively usually survived, while hesitation meant death. Reed aimed at the sergeant who was moving to flank him and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report echoed through the chamber like thunder, and Sergeant Mills spun around with a cry of pain as the heavy slug took him in the shoulder. The soldier's rifle clattered to the stone floor as he fell, clutching his wounded arm and rolling behind whatever cover he could find. The gunshot triggered chaos in the chamber. The other soldiers opened fire, their muzzle flashes creating strobing light that turned the ancient sanctuary into a scene from hell. Reed rolled behind his stone barrier as bullets chipped fragments from the rock around him, sending ancient dust cascading from the ceiling. But the mountain lion reacted to the gunfire with the lightning reflexes of a predator. She launched herself at the nearest soldier, Private Johnson, covering 20 feet in a single bound that spoke of power beyond human comprehension. The man's scream was cut short, as 200 pounds of muscle and fury drove him to the ground, his rifle spinning away into the darkness. The captain spun toward the attacking lion, but Reed's second shot took him high in the chest before he could draw a bead on the big cat. The officer staggered backward, his own weapon flying from nerveless fingers as he fought to remain upright. Blood spread across his uniform, dark in the muzzle flashes, and Reed could see the shock in his eyes as he realized that his carefully planned operation was disintegrating into lethal chaos. Corporal Hayes, the last unwounded soldier, found himself caught between two deadly threats with nowhere to run. The chamber's walls hemmed him in on all sides, and both Reed and the mountain lion were positioned to cut off any escape route. The young soldier's training warred with panic as he tried to decide whether to face the human enemy or the natural predator that had just brought down his comrade. Reed worked the Winchester's lever action, chambering a fresh round while keeping Hayes in his sights. The corporal was young, probably no more than 20, and Reed could see the fear and confusion in his face. This wasn't a hardened killer like the captain. This was a young man who had been corrupted by his superiors and might still have enough conscience left to make the right choice. "It's over, son," Reed called out, his voice carrying over the echoes of gunfire. "Your captain's down, your sergeant's wounded, and Johnson won't be getting up again. Drop your weapon, and you might live to see another sunrise." The mountain lion had moved away from Johnson's still form and was stalking toward the wounded sergeant, her yellow eyes fixed on the man who had invaded her territory and threatened her cub. Mills was trying to reload his rifle one-handed, but his wounded arm wasn't cooperating, and the big cat was closing the distance with each silent step. Hayes looked between Reed and the approaching predator, his rifle wavering as he tried to decide which threat to address first. The young soldier's breathing was rapid and shallow, and Reed could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air of the chamber. "Don't make me kill you, Corporal," Reed said, his voice gentler now. "You're young enough to start over, to make different choices, but if you raise that rifle, I'll put you down like a rabid dog." The captain was still alive, though his breathing was labored and blood frothed at his lips. He managed to raise his head enough to glare at Hayes, his voice a harsh whisper that carried the authority of command, even in extremis. "Kill him, Corporal. That's an order. Kill the rancher and the cat, then seal this chamber. The mission must be completed." Reed could see the conflict playing out in the young soldier's face. Duty to his commanding officer, warring with the instinct for survival, and perhaps the first stirrings of moral clarity about what they had been doing in this remote canyon. The corporal's rifle swung between Reed and the mountain lion, his finger white-knuckled on the trigger. The moment stretched out like an eternity, filled with the sound of labored breathing, the drip of water from somewhere deep in the cave system, and the soft padding of the mountain lion's feet as she continued her approach toward the wounded sergeant. In the flickering shadows cast by the soldiers' dropped lanterns, the ancient chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether justice or corruption would prevail in this final confrontation. The decisive moment came when Corporal Hayes lowered his rifle and stepped away from his wounded captain. The young soldier's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the stone chamber. "I'm done, sir. I won't kill any more innocent people for your dirty money." The captain's face contorted with rage, and he managed to draw his sidearm with his left hand despite his chest wound. But Reed was ready for the movement, and his third shot ended the officer's life before the pistol could clear leather. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the chamber one final time, and then silence settled over the ancient sanctuary. The mountain lion had reached Sergeant Mills, who was still struggling with his wounded arm and useless rifle. But instead of attacking, the great cat simply stood over him, her massive form radiating controlled menace. Mills looked up into those yellow eyes and seemed to understand that his life hung by the thinnest of threads, one that could be severed by the slightest aggressive movement. Reed approached Hayes carefully, his Winchester still ready but his finger off the trigger. The young corporal had thrown down his weapon and stood with his hands raised. But Reed had learned too much about the depths of this conspiracy to trust anyone wearing a uniform. "Smart choice, son," Reed said, kicking the corporal's rifle away while keeping his own weapon trained on the surviving soldiers. "Now tell me about tomorrow's transaction. Who are you selling those weapons to, and where is the meeting supposed to take place?" Hayes glanced at his wounded sergeant, then at the body of his captain, and Reed could see the moment when the young man decided that loyalty to dead officers was less important than staying alive. The corporal's voice was shaky but clear as he began to talk. "There's a buyer coming up from Mexico, revolutionary faction that's been fighting the government down there. They're bringing gold enough to make us all rich in exchange for 50 repeating rifles and 10,000 rounds of ammunition." Reed felt his heart sink as he realized the scope of what he had interrupted. 50 modern rifles in the hands of revolutionaries could fuel years of border violence, drawing American forces into conflicts that would cost hundreds of lives and destabilize the entire region. "Where's the meeting?" Reed demanded. "Devil's Backbone, about 5 miles north of here, noon tomorrow." Hayes swallowed hard before continuing. "The captain was going to leave for the rendezvous at first light with a pack train. If we don't show up, the buyers will know something went wrong." Reed processed this information while keeping watch on both soldiers and the mountain lion, who was still standing over the wounded sergeant. The big cat seemed to understand that the immediate threat was over, but she remained alert, ready to protect her territory if any of the humans made threatening moves. From deeper in the cave came a weak mewing sound, the wounded cub calling for its mother. The mountain lion's ears pricked forward at the sound, and Reed could see the conflict in her posture between staying to guard the defeated humans and returning to care for her offspring. "Go to your baby," Reed said softly, though he wasn't sure if the big cat could understand his words or tone. "These men won't hurt anyone else." As if she truly did understand, the mountain lion looked directly at Reed for a long moment. Then she turned and padded back into the shadows, where her injured cub waited. Reed heard the soft sounds of a mother comforting her young, and felt a tightness in his chest as he thought about Sarah and the children they had lost. Reed turned his attention back to the wounded sergeant, who was still clutching his shoulder and breathing heavily. Mills was older than the corporal, probably a career soldier who had been corrupted by years of frontier service and the easy money that came from looking the other way when officers bent the rules. "How long has this been going on?" Reed asked. Mills glared at him with undimmed hostility, but Hayes answered before the sergeant could speak. "About a year. Started small, just a few rifles here and there that got lost in transit. But the captain got greedy, and the buyers kept wanting more. We've been diverting whole shipments for the last 6 months." Reed thought about the murdered officer whose bones lay scattered around the chamber. "What about Lieutenant Morrison, the man whose remains are in this cave?" Hayes looked sick. He found out about the missing weapons and started asking questions. "The captain said he was going to report us to the territorial governor. We couldn't let that happen." "So you murdered him?" "The captain did the shooting." Mills spoke for the first time, his voice hoarse with pain. "But we all helped bury him. We're all guilty." Reed felt the weight of Sarah's ring in his pocket, along with the documents that could expose the conspiracy. He had the evidence he needed to bring down the entire operation, but he was still one man in the middle of a wilderness, hours away from any legitimate authority. The immediate problem was what to do with the surviving soldiers. Mills was wounded but still dangerous, and while Hayes seemed genuinely repentant, Reed couldn't be sure the young man wouldn't try to escape or warn other members of the conspiracy if given the chance. "Here's what's going to happen," Reed said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had taken command of the situation. "Corporal Hayes, you're going to help me bind up the sergeant's wound. Then we're all going to walk out of this canyon together, and you're going to tell the territorial authorities everything you know about this conspiracy." Hayes nodded eagerly, but Mills shook his head. "You're dreaming, rancher. Even if you get us out of here alive, you think anyone's going to believe the word of a dirt farmer over army officers? This thing goes all the way to the top." Reed pulled the documents from his shirt pocket and showed them to both soldiers. "I've got proof. Names, dates, correspondence between your captain and his contacts. More than enough to bring down everyone involved, regardless of their rank or connections." For the first time, Mills looked genuinely worried. The wounded sergeant seemed to realize that his situation was far more desperate than he had initially understood. Reed had evidence that could hang him and everyone else involved in the conspiracy. From the shadows came the sound of the mother lion caring for her cub, gentle rumbling sounds that spoke of fierce protection and unconditional love. Reed thought about his own quest for vengeance and how it had transformed into something larger, a fight for justice that went far beyond his personal losses. The mountain lion had never been his enemy. She had been driven to desperate measures by the same corruption that now threatened the stability of the entire territory. In protecting her cub, she was doing what any parent would do when faced with threats to their family. Reed Mallory looked at the two defeated soldiers, the scattered evidence of their crimes, and the documents that could restore justice to a territory where it had been perverted by greed and corruption. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey back to civilization, carrying with him the proof needed to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But tonight, in this ancient chamber where so many secrets were buried, Reed found peace in knowing that he had chosen justice over vengeance, protection over destruction. The mountain lion and her cub would live, the surviving soldiers would face trial for their crimes, and the weapons that might have fueled years of violence would never reach their intended buyers. It was, Reed thought, as he began the work of binding wounds and preparing for the journey ahead, what Sarah would have wanted him to do. 6 months later, Reed Mallory stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The new structure was smaller than the original, built with an eye toward practicality rather than grand ambitions, but it felt more like home than the previous house ever had, perhaps because it had been constructed with hard-earned wisdom rather than youthful optimism. The corral held a dozen head of cattle, good stock, but not the ambitious herd he and Sarah had once dreamed of running. Reed had learned that sometimes the most sustainable dreams were the modest ones, the plans that worked with the land, rather than trying to dominate it. The new barn bore a sign that hadn't been there before, Mallory Ranch, in partnership with the wild. The sign reflected the most significant change in Reed's approach to frontier living. After his experience in Redwater Canyon, he had come to understand that human settlement and wildlife could coexist if people were willing to respect the natural order rather than simply imposing their will upon it. His ranch now included deliberate corridors for wildlife movement, water sources that served both domestic stock and wild animals, and grazing patterns that left room for the native species that had called this land home long before white settlers arrived. Jim Hawthorne rode up the valley trail as Reed was finishing his morning coffee, the old-timer's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. The two men had grown closer since Reed's return from the canyon, bonded by shared experiences and mutual respect for the lessons the frontier could teach those wise enough to listen. "Morning, Reed," Jim called as he dismounted near the porch. "Thought you might want to see this." He handed Reed a telegram that had arrived in Millfield the previous evening. Reed unfolded the yellow paper and read the message from the territorial governor, officially commending him for his service to the territory and informing him that the last of the weapons-smuggling conspirators had been sentenced by the federal court in Salt Lake City. Justice finally served. Jim observed, settling into the chair Reed had set aside for their morning conversations. Took longer than it should have, but the truth has a way of coming out eventually. Reed nodded, thinking about the months of testimony, depositions, and legal proceedings that had followed his emergence from Redwater Canyon with 2 wounded soldiers, and evidence of conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The trial had been a sensation, exposing corruption that led to the removal of several high-ranking officials and a complete reorganization of the military supply system. Corporal Hayes had testified for the prosecution, his honest account of the conspiracy helping to ensure convictions for everyone involved. The young man had been sentenced to 5 years in military prison, but Reed had heard that he was using his time to learn to read and write, preparing for a different kind of life when his debt to society was paid. Sergeant Mills had been less cooperative, maintaining his silence until the very end. He was serving 20 years for his role in multiple murders, and Reed doubted the man would live to see freedom again. Some corruption ran too deep to be redeemed by mere punishment. "Any word from the canyon?" Reed asked, as he did every time Jim visited. The old-timer's face softened. "Matter of fact, there is. That mountain lion and her cub are doing fine. The Territorial Wildlife Office has been keeping an eye on them, making sure they're not bothered by curiosity seekers or trophy hunters. The cub's leg healed up good, and they've been spotted hunting together near the main canyon." Reed felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The mother lion's recovery and her success in raising her wounded offspring represented something important, proof that even in a world marked by human violence and disruption, the natural order could heal itself if given the chance. The territorial government had declared Redwater Canyon a protected area, partly to preserve the archaeological sites, but mostly to ensure that the weapons cache locations were secured and the evidence of criminal activity preserved for future legal proceedings. But Reed liked to think that the protection also served the mountain lions, giving them a sanctuary where they could live without fear of human interference. Martha Coleman arrived just after noon, as had become her custom on Sundays. She brought news from town, a basket of fresh bread, and the kind of gentle companionship that helped fill the empty spaces in Reed's life without trying to replace what he had lost. Their relationship was comfortable and unhurried, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss rather than the passionate intensity of his marriage to Sarah. "The newspaper came in on yesterday's stage," Martha said, settling into the chair Sarah used to occupy. "There's an article about your adventure in that Eastern magazine, Harper's Weekly, I think it was called." Reed grimaced. Despite his efforts to avoid publicity, the story of the Canyon conspiracy had attracted national attention. Writers and journalists had descended on the territory, eager to tell tales of corruption and heroism that would sell magazines in distant cities. Most of the articles bore little resemblance to what had actually happened, transforming Reed's desperate fight for survival into the kind of adventure story that city dwellers seem to crave. "They're calling you the Mountain Lion Marshal," Martha continued with obvious amusement. "Apparently, you single-handedly fought off an army of corrupt soldiers with nothing but your trusty rifle and the help of a faithful mountain lion companion." Reed shook his head ruefully. "Sarah always said that newspapers were better for starting fires than learning the truth. I'm starting to think she was right." But despite his discomfort with the attention, Reed understood that the publicity served a useful purpose. The story of the Canyon conspiracy had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle between honest settlers, trying to build decent communities, and the various forces of corruption that threatened frontier society. If his experience could help other people recognize and resist such corruption, then perhaps the embellishment was worthwhile. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley, Reed walked out to the small cemetery where Sarah was buried. He had expanded the fenced area to include a marker for Lieutenant Morrison, the murdered officer whose bones they had recovered from the canyon. It seemed fitting that the two victims of different kinds of violence should rest together in the peaceful valley that Reed was learning to call home again. Reed knelt beside Sarah's grave and pulled her wedding ring from his pocket. For months after her death, he had carried it as a reminder of loss and a symbol of his isolation from the world of the living. But his experience in the canyon had taught him that the past, however precious, couldn't be allowed to prevent engagement with the present. "I think you'd approve of what I'm doing here," Reed said softly, addressing the simple wooden cross that marked his wife's resting place. "Trying to build something that works with the land instead of fighting it, making room for all the creatures that call this place home." He slipped the ring back into his pocket, but with a different feeling than before. It was still a connection to Sarah and the love they had shared, but it was no longer a chain binding him to grief and isolation. Instead, it had become a reminder of the values she had tried to teach him: compassion, understanding, and the wisdom to see beyond immediate circumstances to the larger patterns that connected all life. As Reed walked back toward the house, he caught sight of movement on the distant ridge that separated his valley from the canyon country beyond. Two shapes moved across the skyline, a large cat and a smaller one, probably the mother lion and her grown cub from Redwater Canyon. They paused for a moment, silhouetted against the evening sky, before disappearing into the wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Reed smiled, feeling a connection to those distant predators that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness. They were all survivors, all creatures trying to build meaningful lives in a world that offered no guarantees and demanded constant adaptation to changing circumstances. The ranch house glowed with warm light as Reed approached, and he could smell the dinner that Martha was preparing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: cattle to tend, fences to mend, the endless work of building a sustainable life on the frontier. But tonight, Reed Mallory was content to sit on his porch and watch the stars emerge over a valley where justice had been served, balance had been restored, and the natural order continued its ancient rhythms despite the temporary disruptions caused by human ambition and greed. In the distance, a mountain lion's call echoed across the canyon, country wild, free, and unafraid. Reed listened to that sound until it faded into silence, then went inside to join the people who had chosen to share his journey toward a better understanding of what it meant to live in harmony with the wild country that had shaped them all.